Okay, hi everyone. We'll start in just a moment or two. So welcome to this Fringe meeting of the STUC 2020 on higher education, COVID, and how we make the universities safe. I'll introduce the speakers in a few moments, but we'll just give it a moment or two before we start, if that's okay. Okay, I think we can start now, if that's okay with everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to this Fringe meeting. My name is Carlo Morelli. I'm a lecturer at the University of Dundee, senior lecturer in economics. I'm president of UCU Scotland. And we've got a number of different speakers to talk a bit about the COVID crisis and responding to the crisis in higher education in Scotland. And hopefully we'll have time for some questions and discussion from the floor. I'll introduce the speakers that we've got. There's a little bit of a change to the lineup that we were originally planning. So I'm very grateful for everyone who's agreed to speak at the last moment. And that's because one of the speakers we were hoping to have, Jo Grady, our General Secretary in UCU, is unable to make this today's meeting for personal reasons. So I'm sure we all hope everything's okay. And we hope to see us soon. But we've got four speakers today. We've got Matt Crilly, who's the Scottish president of NUS, and Mary Senior, who many will know as the Scottish official for UCU Scotland, but you may not know that she's just been elected president of the STUC, so congratulations to Mary on those respects. We've got Anne Swinney, who is the Honorary Secretary of UCU Scotland, and will be joining us slightly later, because he's joining us shortly. Professor Steve Reicher, who's a Professor of Psychology at St Andrews University, and importantly is a member of the government SAGE group, particularly linked to behavioural decision making. Okay, so each speaker is going to speak for hopefully not more than around 7 or 8 minutes. Shorter the better, because then there's more time for questions and discussions. And we're ably supported by Pri and Seamus doing the sign language, so interpretation. So thank you for that. So let me call on Matt Crilly and welcome Matt to say a few words a bit about the NUS students and the issues that students are facing in terms of the university sector. Welcome, Matt, and thanks for attending. I'll hand over to you to speak for a few moments. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Carlo. And yeah, I just want to say my best wishes to Jo, and a massive congrats to Mary on your presidency. Big well done. So yeah, how do we keep universities safe? I think the short answer is listen to the students and the staff. Throughout the summer, we as the National Union Students, yourselves as the Universities and Colleges Union, we're calling for online learning to be the default where possible, and perhaps what we might now dub restricted blended learning, as it's now become known as we enter Tier 4. And I think really this has been a real crisis point for our universities. Often for those of us that are involved in the sector, and myself involved in the student politics, student unions, the National Union Students, we often speak about the marketization of education. And for students, sometimes in recent years, when we've had these discussions, it's been quite a difficult thing for people to get their heads around. It's not easy to delve into, and explain this structural force and what marketization of education means. I think when we talk about the marketization of education, I think students now get what it means. I think it's very, very clear now what the marketization of education is. So this year we had students being encouraged back onto campus over promises of in-person teaching, of blended learning. And then when they arrived into densely populated student halls, they found that most of their learning was actually online. And I think really students didn't really get what had been promised to them. And we saw mass outbreaks in student accommodation. Thousands of students across the country, I think, having to self-isolate repeatedly because of the nature of the student accommodation, the densely populated student accommodation. And it's been a really, really stark time where students struggle to get access to food, water, at the beginning of this self-isolation, the outbreaks in halls. We're struggling to get access to the most basic necessities to be able to complete self-isolation and get through a lockdown. And it's a lockdown in what is incredibly cramped conditions. Some people on the call, even our older academics who may have been to university as a student a very long time ago, a lot of the student accommodation probably hasn't changed in that time, and they're cramped, small conditions. And so it was really sad to see students having to self-isolate within these conditions, not necessarily getting the support that they needed. But the support did improve over time. But what is crucial is, it did kind of come back to a situation where if students are being encouraged onto campus, of course, the students need to move into the student accommodation. And of course, we saw the outbreaks. And yeah, it did take me by surprise, to what extent universities encouraged their students back to campus. But I think now we've got some real challenges as we look forward towards the winter break. We are, really happy to see the Scottish Government introduce a mass asymptomatic testing plan to try and get students home for the winter break, and try and do it safely. I think that's really to be welcome, because now I think we're looking at potentially a mental health crisis. We know from NUS research that just under 3/4 of students, it's their first year. It's their first year where they struggle with their mental health, their first year at university. And you think about where we've seen the outbreaks. It's been in student accommodation, the halls where the first years live, the 17 and 18-year-olds away from home for the first time, away from their family and their support networks. So I think the move to get students home through mass asymptomatic testing is really welcome. And again, particularly the Christmas period approaching the next couple of weeks, is when students' exams take place. It's when final assignments pile up. It's a real crunch point for poor student mental health. So we do welcome the move to try and get folk home safely. But that comes with it as well, that students that stay within accommodation need to be fully supported. You have care experienced students, estranged students, international students, where halls is their home. And we really need to see government step up and make funding available to support the students in their accommodation, and get through the winter break. But then we have to turn our attention to January. We don't want to see a repeat of what happened at the end of the summer. I don't want to see students, become an essential part of coronavirus cases within the country. And I'm really worried, because the marketized nature of our education makes me feel like we're about to head into that same environment, where there's an imperative on universities who are seeking fee income, who want the tuition fee income from master's students, international students arriving in January, to basically do what happened at the end of the summer. And it has been really quite disgraceful that students were, many of them paid lots of fees, paid their accommodation, their rent, and having been encouraged because they had to attend in-person teaching, to then see security guards, big burly security guards, patrolling corridors and pouncing at the faintest sound of Little Mix, to try and police students. It's been a really really pressing time for education, and I think we need to do all we can to make sure that students are safe, staff are safe, and the wider communities are safe. And I think that really means, if there's a time, there needs to be lessons learned from the end of the summer. We need to see online learning as a default. I don't think, many students don't like online learning, many staff don't like online teaching, but we're in a global pandemic, and I think the safety of all of us has to be the priority. We need to make digital funding available so that students from working class backgrounds can access learning. But for me, that's the priority coming into the next couple of months. We need to ensure that we're all keeping each other safe.
Okay, thanks, Matt. That was really, really helpful. And the solidarity, the links, the work between students and staff, making universities the places that they are, is crucial to what we do. So ensuring that our interests and student interests are aligned and that we're all fighting for the same things is crucially important in all of this process. So thanks for speaking, and certainly take our solidarity back to all the students in NUS, both here in Scotland and elsewhere. Our second speaker is Mary Senior. Again, like I said earlier, I'm sure most people know Mary as the full-time official for UCU Scotland, and just again to congratulate her on becoming the STUC president today, I believe, or was it yesterday? I'm not quite sure exactly when the election was, so she hasn't been in post for very long, that's for sure. So let me hand over to Mary to talk a little bit about the perspective from UCU Scotland. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks very much, Carlo, and thanks to everyone for joining us on this really important webinar today. I'm really sorry that I'm not Jo Grady. As Carlo said, she had a really sad family bereavement earlier this morning or last night, so that's why she's unable to be here. But I know, she sends her apologies and her thanks and best wishes to everyone. Also to say thanks very much to Matt Crilly from NUS Scotland for joining us today. I think the work that we've done together, UCU and all the campus trade unions with NUS, we really have been, representing the views, presenting the concerns and trying to keep students and staff safe. And the Scottish Government have really had to listen to what we've been saying. And I also think perhaps how they handled student returns in the university sector back in September was really one of the biggest mistakes, certainly, that the Scottish Government made. And I think if Jo was here, she would be reiterating that comment, in that at a UK level, universities in England go back a wee bit later than those in Scotland, and they didn't learn any of the lessons that we'd experienced earlier in September. So to say a wee bit about UCU's, I suppose, strategy and our perspective, and I think, when the pandemic hit, first of all, our members who, after all, had been taking industrial action over casualisation, over workloads, over unfair pay, straight away our members shifted everything online. Their workloads increased even further as they came to terms and supported their students when we had lockdown. And as a trade union, I think we then had three overriding priorities, particularly in Scotland. First of all, they were around funding and protecting the sector's viability, because we had real concerns, and the reports that came from the Scottish Funding Council, from University Scotland, and indeed UCU's own calculations showed that there was going to be a massive black hole in our sector because of the over-dependence on commercial income, international tuition fee income, and so on. So funding was really important because it does help to keep us safe. I think for us, the second area was around protecting jobs and defending members' terms and conditions, particularly those early career staff and those on casual contracts. And then the final priority was around health and safety, ensuring the safety of students and staff, and really advocating UCU's position that it is entirely possible to deliver learning and student support remotely online, and indeed that should have been the default position. I think key to that was also protecting those students and staff in the more vulnerable groups, particularly older people, BME people, disabled people, pregnant students and staff, ensuring that they were kept safe and weren't more prone to the virus and the serious illness and even worse that might have been there. So we were really, those were the points that we were advocating to government, to employers, and to the wider press and general public. And I think in the summer, as Matt Crilly was saying, we did have really regular contact with the Scottish Government. I think one of the things that we can do a wee bit better in Scotland is work together and listen and engage with each other. And the Scottish Government has set up a group which involves trade unions, the NUS, the employers, the Scottish Funding Council and others. So, it was entirely possible for us to make our representations. And we certainly did make those very strongly. I think where we hit a real problem was over the last weekend in August. We were seeing the updated guidance for our sector, and we were quite content that it actually did say that where it's possible to do learning, teaching from home, that should be what happens. And if you recall, in Scotland, that was the criteria that was out there for everyone. That's the message the First Minister was saying. If you can work from home, do work from home. So we were, relatively relaxed because that's what our sectoral guidance was saying. However, we had a massive shock on Tuesday, the 1st of September, when we were emailed the link of the published guidance, and that default online working had disappeared. I think we knew what had happened there, and various newspapers have done some FOIs and found the trail of emails to show what happened. And it's that the employers really lobbied hard. I think we knew they were doing that earlier in the period, particularly, wanting 1 metre social distancing rather than 2 metres. But their priorities of getting students back onto campus meant that the work that we'd put in was overridden by them. And, I think this was really frustrating, but actually this was incredibly dangerous because it resulted in students coming back onto campus. And it resulted in particularly new students coming to halls of residence with very limited social distancing. And, it's hardly a surprise when you were bringing 6 or 10 or 12 even new people to come and live in a student flat. It really was not surprising that we saw the outbreaks that we did. So I think from UCU's perspective, we fought back very strongly about that, and it was so important that we protected students' safety and well-being, as well as that of staff delivering the learning and teaching. But it's really unfortunate that we had this ambiguity over the term blended learning, and certainly for UCU. A number of universities, it was a real issue. In the University of Edinburgh, in the University of St Andrews, in Dundee and in Abertay in particular were real flashpoints. Strathclyde to a certain extent, albeit I think our branch there were able to negotiate with their employers and at least not have the pressure that some of our other members had to actually be delivering their teaching and be coerced to being on campus. More recently, we've then had the new strategic framework, which the First Minister announced on the 23rd of October and was due to take effect from the 2nd of November. And we saw then that the First Minister, that document introduced a new term that was going to be applicable in levels 3 and 4 called restricted blended. So that it'll be 4 weeks on Friday since that document was launched, but it was only last night that we had an actual definition on what restricted blended learning actually means, which is about time really, because it's particularly relevant for institutions in Glasgow, in Stirling, in the west of Scotland generally, because all of those areas are now moving into the level 4. And I think to a certain extent, we're pleased that restricted blended learning for level 4 areas is going to come back to our position of default online. It says all learning will be online, only time sensitive that cannot be deferred and needs to be done now has to be done in person. And even then there are going to be additional mitigations. So that's certainly what UCU asked for. Our issue is that also needs to apply in level 3 and also in level 2, because the virus is still about, as we can see from the fact that we've moved into level 4 in a good number of areas in Scotland. We need to be keeping students and staff safe. So when we see the Minister tomorrow, because we have another one of these groups around higher education and further education, whilst welcoming the clarity we received last night, I think we'll certainly be pushing the Minister that strong definition for level 4 restricted blending needs to apply to level 3 and level 2 areas too. So so I'll leave it there, Carlo, because I know there's lots of questions, and I know that I've got comments too. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, Mary. That's a really good summary. Thank you very much for that. Clearly, there's going to be more discussion and questions around what restricted blended learning means. Also, the move to mass testing of students on campus so they can get home for Christmas. That's clearly going to be a bit of a discussion we can have later. Let me move on to the third speaker we've got this morning, or this afternoon we are now, aren't we? Anne Swinney, who's the Honorary Secretary of UCU Scotland. Again, she's at University of Dundee alongside myself. So, Anne, do you want to say a few words a bit about what's been happening in branches around these issues? Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for asking me along to speak today. I just wanted to talk briefly about the issues that staff are facing in the current environment. One of my roles is caseworker coordinator for the UCU branch in Dundee. So looking at what's going on really from that perspective, and it's been quite an eye opener. As Matt, really following on from Matt, as branch members, we warned management against encouraging students onto campus. But, as we all know now, those warnings were ignored. And sadly, the predictions that we were making came true. And like everyone else, we want to move forward to a position where, going into January, we can do far better for our students. And that is not to criticise the work in any way of our members, because what I've observed over the last few months is staff in universities going above and beyond in terms of the work and the effort that they've put in terms of the versatility, the willingness to do their utmost, their best for students, to make that experience for students as good as it can be. But let's be frank, we're actually up against it in terms of doing this. And that has had, I would say, quite a serious impact on the health and well-being of university staff. And as a case work coordinator, I have seen a huge increase in the number of cases which relate to stress and anxiety. And staff feeling in a situation where, they are genuinely struggling to cope. At the moment, universities, the university management are constantly thanking staff for the good work that they are doing. However, what I am seeing from a casework perspective is that these thanks are not translating into actions. So more and more work is being piled on staff. And I'm not just talking here about academic staff, I'm talking about the support staff around the IT staff who are more and more central to the work that we do now in universities. During the summer, what I saw was staff failing to have holidays, failing to have that normal break. And I have to say that is now, the impact of that is becoming very, very clear on the health and well-being of staff. So we really, really need to keep pushing in terms of university management about the impact of what they are doing and about the plans that they're having are impacting on our staff. I don't want to just focus on the negative here, because I actually think there have been some real positives, if you like, that have come out of these last months and weeks in the university. What we've seen, for example, is the power, let's say, of collective action, of solidarity that unions can offer. We've seen the membership of UCU across the UK increase. So now that we have over 130,000 members, it's the highest level of membership that we have had. So that is a real positive, and that tells me that people are actually recognising what we have been doing and what we can do as a union and collectively to support staff in universities. I would also point to UCU Solidarity Movement. We've had opportunities working online to meet with our colleagues across the country in ways that we have not been able to do in the past. And I would just really encourage our members and to take advantage of the opportunity that this type of working presents, even though, despite all the drawbacks, I think that we really do need to actually focus in on what this can do for us. I'll just stop there because I think the experiences that we've had in Dundee and elsewhere, I'm sure you're all thinking, yeah, that's actually what's been happening in our institutions. But I would just make a real appeal to everyone to like think how we can actually come together on events like this and others to work together to improve the working conditions of all our members. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Anne. And I'd just like to re-emphasise the points that Anne's been making about the levels of casework, the amount of stress that staff members are facing in universities, and the work that they're putting in to try and make the online learning high enough quality for what students deserve. Okay, our last speaker before we open up to questions is Professor Steve Reicher. I'm very pleased to have Stephen speaking here. I've seen him on TV an awful lot over the past few months, as I'm sure lots of others have done. Stephen's a professor of psychology at St Andrews University. He's on the government SAGE group for behavioural science, and has been one of the most critical in terms of the understanding the way in which support for those who are working from home or those who are furloughed is needed in order to make sure that the behaviours do bring down the virus levels. And he's certainly been one of those who stand up for the vulnerable and those who find it most difficult at this time. So Stephen, welcome to this. I know you came a little bit later. If you can speak for 5-10 minutes, anything like that. We've got a number of questions, and I'll bring in the questions afterwards, just so that before Stephen speaks. I've got around a dozen or so questions in around 4 groups, really. So I'll group them together and read them out. But if others want to add in more questions, you can do in the chat function. So please feel free to. Okay, Stephen, over to you. Thanks very much for coming.
Well, thanks for inviting me. And as a grassroots member of UCU, it's a privilege to be here with the grandees of UCU. I don't know if Carlo thinks of himself as a grandee, but we do, Carlo. We do. I should also say that I'm involved in independent SAGE as well as in the behavioural subgroup of SAGE, and I think I speak more on behalf of independent SAGE than SPI-B. In fact, I'm not in a position to speak on behalf of SPI-B. As we now know, on the 21st of September, SAGE itself had a meeting where they called for a so-called circuit breaker, and part of that circuit breaker was suspension of in-person teaching and using online teaching as the default. And at about the same time, Independent SAGE publicly put out a document. We put out a document on the return of universities in which we made a similar call. Now, there are 3 main things I think we have learnt in this pandemic. The first is, if you want to control the pandemic, if you want to save lives, if you want to restore the economy, you need to act fast. Actually, that was said by the head of emergency response of the WHO right back in March. He said, whatever you do, do it quickly. If you dither, if you take time, the infections will only spike, you'll have to do more, and it will be harder, and it will last longer. So act fast. That's the first thing we learned. The second thing we learned was that half measures are no good in this pandemic. Restrictions which don't limit the ability of the infection to spread just prolong the misery. Actually, we're seeing at the moment that when you look at the restrictions in the medium levels, levels 2, for instance, they're not bringing the infections down. We have to do more to have an effect. And I think people understand that while people have shown remarkable resilience all through the country in terms of being able to put up with restrictions, they're not going to do it if it's pointless, and people are more willing to do things if they think there's going to be a payoff than if they do nothing. Half measures don't work. Half measures just leave us in a limbo and force us to put up with restrictions that affect our lives without bringing about gain. And the third thing we know is that if there's one very simple way of thinking about the pandemic, it's that the root of infection is exposure. The more you're exposed, the more you're likely to get infected. So it's got nothing to do with misbehavior. The government likes to wag its finger at people and tell them they've misbehaved. It likes to blame groups. It likes to blame students. It likes to blame young people. Actually, you are more likely to get infected if you are more exposed. And you're more exposed if you have to work in public-facing jobs, if you have to go on public transport because you can't afford a car, if you live in multi-occupancy housing or multi-occupancy flats in particular. And we know that's true of students. Students don't have cars, they have to use public transport. Students, above all, live in multi-occupancy flats. And the fact that students got infected in October was not surprising. It's not because of the house party. It's not because people misbehaved. It's because it was inevitable in the circumstances. So we shouldn't be blaming students. We should be asking, what can we do to limit exposure? What can we do in order to bring down the infection rate? Now, in that regard, why then do we harp on about in-person teaching so much? Why do we see it as so important? After all, Universities UK said to us, well, it's relatively trivial. We've got all sorts of safeguards. It's not where the dangers lie. Well, first of all, I think that's a rather optimistic overstatement. We know from many of our colleagues, I know from talking to many of my friends, that actually a lot of the time the mitigations really are not good enough, and that people are being put in situations which are not entirely safe. But more importantly, in-person teaching is in a sense the hub around which all sorts of other things resolve. So for instance, if we're talking about going back for Christmas and staggering that in a way that will make a difference, then of course you've got to end in-person teaching so people can go home. If you don't want halls to be overcrowded with too many people in accommodation, you need to make sure that actually people have got the choice, that people are able to work from home as well as from campus. And some people will want to and some people won't want to, but you've got to give the possibility. And the third thing, of course, is that if you have to go on in-person teaching, you also have to travel. And therefore, you have to have thousands of journeys. And some of those journeys go across the borders of different tiers in Scotland. For a long time, Dundee, where lots of St Andrews students live, was in tier 3, and St Andrews in Fife was in tier 2. Now, although it was allowed, it wasn't against the rules, nonetheless, all that travel then led to, inevitably, greater probabilities of the spread of infection. So as I say, the issue of in-person teaching is the hub around which we are able or not able to limit exposure, to limit the extent to which people are likely to get the infection or not. And so it seems to me that the danger and the problem with the response around universities is it's violated all 3 rules. The 21st of September. And they're not talking about suspending in-person teaching until early December or the end of November, right? That's not quick. A snail would be quicker than that. In terms of no half measures, well, limiting students' exposure and limiting the amount of interaction there is with the rest of the community is an inherent measure that is absolutely critical to a successful set of restrictions, called for again on the 21st of September, still not in place. And thirdly, the point is that what we're doing increases exposure. And increasing exposure, it puts students in danger, and it puts staff in danger, all staff, not just academic staff, it puts the community in danger. And therefore, it seems to me it's important to make that call and make that call very clearly again. True, there have been some improvements, and it's pleasing to see that there's going to be testing. It's pleasing to see there's going to be a little bit of staggering. It's pleasing to see that for a little bit of time, we might suspend in-person teaching. But then we've got the problem of people coming back again, coming back after the break. All the dangers of having sent people out to all sorts of communities to mingle, potentially to spread the disease, and then coming back from all over the country and all over the world. And it seems to me we need to go back to those principles, to act quickly, to act decisively, and to limit exposure. And in order to do that, and to safeguard our entire community, our local community, our student community, our staff community, there are a number of measures that we need to take that are very simple. So the first, again, is to say that not just for a short term, but over the longer term, probably over the next semester, we need to make sure that in-person teaching is suspended unless it's absolutely necessary. So online should be the default. Number 2, students should be able to make the choice as to whether they study from their homes or come to university towns, and that they should be able, therefore, to study at home, thereby making the halls less crowded and making them safer for the people who are there. And thirdly, They should be able to do so without any detriment, without financial detriment, or indeed any other detriment. Now, of course, to make that possible, there are a number of things that need to be done. I mean, the first is, when we talk about education in general, we tend to have forgotten about inequalities and digital inequalities. In schools, those issues of digital inequality are apparently clear, very obvious indeed. So many thousands of children are off school now because they have to self-isolate, but not all of them have computers. Not all of them have Wi-Fi, and not all of them have the textbooks they need, but the same issues are there for students. So one thing we need to make sure of in order to enable students to do the right thing and universities to do the right thing is to give financial support to students. And secondly, we need to give financial support to universities so they're not in peril by allowing students to go home. We need that support from the government in order to allow universities and students to do the right thing in order to protect the entire community. And with that responsibility, we will be much better able to deal with this pandemic and maintain the education of our students. Thanks, Steve. That was really helpful. And you touched on a number of things that people have asked in questions afterwards. So I'm going to raise that with you again. I'll give you a bit of a break rather than speak straight away. So I'll come back to those questions in a short while. We've had around a dozen or so questions put forward. There's time for people to be able to put them in the chat in Facebook and on YouTube. But I've got really 4 subject areas for the different questions. So what I suggest is I group them together, and then not everyone on the panel has to answer to all of them. They're more directed to one rather than the other people on the panel, but feel free to come in if you want. So let me just ask the first set of questions, and I think these are really based around the relationship between the universities and their decision making and government policy. So I'll bring Mary in first to talk about these. So let me just read out the questions. I've got 3 of them here. The first one is why are universities so keen to have in-person teaching when it can be done online? The second one was, has government agreed a definition of restricted blended learning? What does it mean for universities? And the third one was really about the lobbying of the Scottish government to get the guidance changed. You mentioned that in your talk. What's your feeling about the influence universities as a group of employers under the University of Scotland are having in influencing government relative to National Uni students, UCU, and other interested bodies? So that's the first set of questions. May, do you want to come back on that, and then see if anyone else wants to contribute?
Yeah, thanks, Carlo. I mean, I think Steve particularly has touched a lot on the reason why universities were so keen to have in-person teaching, and Matt to a large extent too. And, you know, I think there are 3 prime reasons. I mean, first, and I guess the first reason, and we possibly agree to a certain extent, that actually engaging in person, you know, is a good way to work. It does enable you to see the whole picture. It enables you to get your message across much more clearly if everyone is in the same room engaging together. So I think we all accept that to a certain extent. But then I think the second reason, and this has been really problematic, and it links to what Matt said about the marketization of the sector, and also what Steve has said about the need for finances for universities, and the fact that they so depended upon particularly commercial income from residencies. You know, accommodation was a big part of it, but also all of the stuff on campus, all the cafes and the you know, coffee bars and all of that. I think that, you know, we know that universities in Scotland have been consistently underfunded in terms of the teaching grant, and having to rely on commercial income when that was drying up has been problematic. And then the final reason, and I think this really does link with the first, and it worries me to a certain extent, the way that I worry that universities are hiding behind it, and they're talking about the sort of mental health and student retention, and we see that in the guidance that the Scottish Government published last night, and of course it's really important to take care of people's well-being and their health and safety. However, I think there's considerable anxiety. There's also the risks of actually catching COVID, and no one has made enough about the reality of long COVID and the implications that may have on young people as well of those who are particularly vulnerable. So I think those are some of the reasons why universities were so keen to have in-person teaching. Your second question, Carlo, was on restricted blended, and I explained that, we've been really frustrated about this, because it seems bizarre that a government will set out a new strategic framework and use terms and create terms and not actually define what they mean until nearly 4 weeks after that guidance has been first published. And indeed, this restricted blended learning was in place from the 2nd of November in most of the universities in Scotland. And it was only last night that we saw that definition. And I think, for level 3, it's still not strong enough for us, because it says that universities can use health and well-being and mental health reasons to claim that claim that provision needs to be done in person. And I think our worry is that they're going to use that to coerce staff and students to be on campus. For level 4, and obviously all the Glasgow institutions, Stirling, West Scotland, that's much more restrictive. It is default online, so I really can't see that that people should be being forced to be on site in places like Strathclyde or Cali or West of Scotland anymore. In terms of the lobbying, do you want me to go on to that question?
Yeah, briefly, if you can, and then I'll open it up to others.
Yeah, I mean, we've had so many meetings. In fact, there's 2 meetings happening right now that 2 of our colleagues are attending on testing and student accommodation. So we've had the meetings, we've had the engagement. I think it's a frustration from our part that the weight placed on the views that trade unions and have been putting forward hasn't been valued to the same extent as the employers. I think we saw a slight reversal of that yesterday when we saw the level 4 restricted blended. We've had some more positive statements from the minister around fair work and decent employment rights and the need for employers to engage with trade unions, to pay proper sick pay to outsourced contractors as well as fixed term and temporary staff. So they've supported our messaging there. But I think it was, I think what we saw in September was a result of them not listening to trade unions, UCU and NUS. So I'll stop.
Thanks, Mary. Matt, do you want to come in? And Steve, you've got your hand up as well. So
yeah. I was just going to say, I think I'm not going to say who it was that said it to me, but someone said to me, if we'd moved to online learning and we told students it was online learning, international students wouldn't have come. And that was said to me directly. We weren't hiding behind stuff, and that's the reality of the situation. Is we think we have public education, public higher education in Scotland, but for many of our largest universities, our oldest universities, tuition fee outcome is greater than the public investment. So there's a real reliance on that, and the financial support wasn't made available to the universities. The UK government offered, a big shiny package that came with lots of strings attached, and some of them ideological, including describing what I'm doing in front of you today as niche activism that universities should no longer support. So the financial support for universities wasn't there. So inevitably they pushed towards encouraging students to come back to campus, or else they would have lost the tuition fee income. And I think it's, the international students have had a really raw deal, £20,000 a year, coming across the world in the most difficult of circumstances, arriving and never getting to meet necessarily your classmates, never, not being able to build any form of social network once you arrive because of the restrictions. And that's because they were encouraged to come. And I think, online learning is difficult. It's not without its challenges. There's lots of problems around access and social support networks that you don't get in person. But we are in a pandemic, like we're dealing with a virus. And I think what students need just now is for the universities to be honest, be honest with students. The universities are now chatting about, there's going to be in-person teaching in January. We know there's not going to be mass in-person teaching in January. Do we really think there's going to be mass in-person teaching in January? Of course there's not, but it's the structures are at work, and it's to encourage again more students to arrive for tuition fees, for rental incomes, and it's just that it's a totally raw deal, and it's the marketization of our education, I think, is really on show. And if we are to avoid it, I think, as it's been said, there needs to be public investment like that needs to come. We need to protect our institutions. We don't want them to fail because they don't receive tuition fee income because international students say, I'm not coming if I'm going to be studying online. We don't want our institutions to fail. It needs to be public investment and not a system that's built on fees. If you build an education system based on the market, it's going to be subject to the big declines in the market when the market collapses.
Okay, thanks Matt. Stephen, did you want to say a few words, and then we'll move on to the next group of questions?
I'll try and be brief. I mean, at some level, I feel a bit sorry for vice chancellors and principals. They're a bit like pub owners, because once you turn students into customers, they fear losing custom, and so they want to keep it open even when it's not very good for anybody's health, and they're caught in a terrible bind. I mean, they're not necessarily want to do harm people's health, and I think they're genuinely concerned for students, but they are caught in that genuine bind. And quite apart from the fact that they shouldn't be in that bind, and we shouldn't be in a position where students are custom who you don't want to lose, I think they're wrong. I think they're wrong to think that if they keep in-person teaching, they'll be more likely to attract students. First of all, when you look at the research on online teaching versus in-person teaching, there's no clear superiority of in-person teaching. It's how you do the two. You can do online teaching, so it's just as successful in terms of outcomes. But actually, the comparison isn't between online and normal in-person, because if you go in person, you're sitting there all separated, in masks, not being able to see each other, not talking to each other. And actually many people have got the experience of actually the online teaching where everybody can see each other's faces and can interact is actually far better. So there is no clear evidence at all at any time, especially at this time, that that in-person is better. And secondly, the notion that that students will lose out terribly by not going for teaching. Well, first of all, again, the research on students' social life shows that on the whole, students get far more social life out of the people they live with than the people they study with, who often are very different indeed. So again, in-person teaching doesn't give a great benefit. And in terms of dropping out, it's perfectly true. Some students will want to come to campus and live with their mates, and some will be perfectly happy to stay at home. So give people the choice. And that means that then the campus is less crowded, the halls are less crowded, the density is lower, and therefore infection will be lower. So it seems to me entirely good sense to say that in-person not only is bad for health, but it doesn't bring the benefits that the vice chancellors think. So it doesn't even achieve what they're trying to achieve, though I understand why they're doing it.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I've got the next set of questions. I'm going to direct them initially to Anne, and I think Matt will want to say something about this. So unless Anne wants to come into those last set of questions, I'll read out the next set because I think that Anne wants to say about these questions. So there's a group of them. One is about blended learning and how do we make it work? So what resources are needed to ensure that the quality of blended learning is as it needs to be for students. Then I've got a question on, oh, sorry, my phone's just gone off. There we go. Says, okay, so the next question is, my university claims that students want face-to-face teaching. Is this true? My classes have been very poorly attended so far. Question 6 is, and this is from academic related and professional services. What can ARPS members do if they're being asked to come into work when their job can be done from home? And the final one in this group is, what can we do to make libraries safer for staff and for students? So these all around the other things that are needed to make sure the provision in online in one form or another is made safe, not just teaching. And do you want to kick off with some comments on those?
Sorry, so I'm muting now. Yeah, well, I think I would begin by just saying resources as a general point. Blended learning, if I start there, how can we make it work? If you like, the skill set amongst the university staff varies hugely. Some staff are very skilled and experienced in terms of online learning. How can we make it work? We need to support staff training and learning in those areas. But again, what we need to think about is, what is the impact on staff workloads? Even before this dispute, staff workloads have been through the roof. The impact of the dispute of COVID on staff has exacerbated the situation. Workload have expanded enormously. So and at the same time, we have quite a lot of cases, and well, Heriot-Watt's an example where there's been attempts to reduce staffing in universities and reduce those resources. We cannot offer quality blended learning without the resources that support it. So my key thing would be training and resources of what needed here. And when I talk about resources, I mean staff, because we always hear that the matter that, you know, what are universities' key resources? Universities' key resources are their staff. I'll move on to the next question about universities and the claim that students want face-to-face. Yes, some students do, of course, want face-to-face. Not all students want face-to-face. We've got to remember that our students are not a homogeneous group. The needs of the student body vary hugely. They vary as much as the number of students that are in that student body. My own experience has been, for over the past 7 years, a huge amount of my teaching has been blended learning. And I have worked with students online very successfully over that period. It doesn't just happen instantly. People have to learn how to do that, and they have to learn how to be able to teach effectively online. So again, coming back to training and resources, but it's about being responsive, being able to respond to the needs of that varied body of people that we are working with. The question relating to about staff coming into work, our most important, if you like, support mechanism here is health and safety. You cannot, as a worker, be exposed to unsafe working conditions, and we can fall back on the Health and Safety at Work Act. Maybe Mary might be able to come in just to remind me of the technical terms here. But you cannot be expected to be exposed to unreasonable risk in the workplace. And I would always advise my members in Dundee and across Scotland to look at that particular piece of legislation in order to be able to support you to make a reasonable decision that you cannot be challenged on in terms of coming into work and endangering yourself. The final question was about library space and how can we make library spaces safe. I don't think we can make library spaces safe. Let's be frank about this. We can make them a bit safer. We can reduce the risk a bit, but we can't actually make them safe. Using libraries, I think library users need to abide by the various social distancing rules that are in place, and as universities, as providers, we need to be very careful that the spaces are not overcrowded, that are not overused, and that there are systems in place for allowing students to access those spaces. But I'm going to go on and say something else. We need to think about how can we enable students to access the libraries without physically accessing the libraries. We need to look at investing in the electronic resources that there are. It's going to cost money. So again, I'm coming back to resources. And for me, that's the safest way for students and staff to use libraries, is to look at investing in our electronic resources.
Thanks, Anne. That was really helpful. The sections of the Health and Safety at Work Act are section 44, which spells out individuals' ability to refuse to work in dangerous environments, and section 100, which sets out the employer's responsibility to make workplaces safe. Does anyone else, Matt, do you want to come in on some of these issues?
Yeah, I was going to say it is difficult, and I think Anne's right, where you've got varying students from varying different institutions that have different needs and asks. So Strathclyde is going to be different from the Royal Conservatoire, and that's going to be different from Edinburgh University in terms of what the students need and want. I do think I'll admit an interest here. I'll declare an interest. I'm a Strathclyder. I'm former president at Strathclyde Student Union. Strathclyde's got the best student union, the best UCU branch. It's on a great modest buffet. And the student union there actually polled their students to find out, because they were hearing from the students, some students who wanted in-person teaching, some wanted a totally online experience unless something was totally essential to take place in person. And they polled their students, and I'll admit, to a room full of academics potentially, it's not necessarily the most the methodology of their polling wasn't the strongest. It was a social networking poll for students on the president's Facebook account. However, I still think it's indicative because it got over 600 responses, and from that, 73% of students said that they wanted an online semester aside from anything absolutely essential that had to take place. So 73% of students said that they wanted the online and not the half in person, half online. And I think that's really important. And again, I'll caveat that there are institutions like the Conservatoire where there's a lot more, for example, practical based stuff and things, and it could be different at different institutions. But I am skeptical when I hear sometimes from principals that students are all clamoring for in-person teaching. And I do think it does come back to the point that Steve made about students being customers and consumers. I think for some of those that are paying £20,000 a year to study, they probably do want some sort of in-person provision and feel 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 that they've not got the whole experience that was sold to them as a customer. But that's an issue with the marketization of our system. So yeah, I think some students do want in-person teaching, but the research that the student unit at Strathclyde done to poll their students, I thought was really indicative.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Unless Mary or Steve want to come in, I've got the next set of questions I'm going to direct at Steve initially, and then then we can open it up again. I'm expecting we'll finish probably around 3:15, if that's okay for everyone. And hopefully the audience, you can stay for a little bit longer, because I know on the hours when things change in the university system. So, but hopefully people can stay a bit longer. Okay, the next set of questions are really about where we go from here, and Steve mentioned some of this in his introduction. So let me put these questions initially to Steve. Okay, the first one is, are the Scottish Government's arrangements for Christmas good enough? Will students potentially need to stay away from home over the Christmas period? It seems like university accommodation has been a problem this semester. Are there plans to make changes after Christmas? And what are the main things universities should do in preparation for semester 2 now? So really, it's really about the future and what happens next semester. So Steve, do you want to kick off your comments on that?
Okay. Well, I think things are better than they were. As I say, I think the plans for testing are welcome. We've got to make sure that they are rolled out systematically and that all students have access to them and have easy access to them. It would be the sooner that you can suspend in-person teaching, so you can begin to stagger the return home, the better. There will be students who can't go home. Of course, there will be overseas students and there will be home students who test positive. And there it's essential, and we said this right back in August, that there is a wraparound program of support for people. And that's not just token support. You knock on somebody's door twice a day and you say to them there's some food outside your door. I mean, that's what you do in prison. It needs to be practical support. There needs to be emotional support. There needs to be continuous contact with people, because there are mental health types of problems. There need to be activities and virtual activities that people can take part in if they have to stay on campus over Christmas. So I am very concerned about making sure that we have provision to full support and dealing with the mental health issues for students who may not be able to go home. And then for the second semester, I would argue that we should go to a situation where we say that the default is online. I accept there are certain courses where you've got to have lab courses and they can't be delayed. But for the great majority, people should be able to have that choice as to whether to work from their hometown or from the campus town. And the students aren't all the same. Different students will want different things. For some, even if it's they don't go into the university, it's very important to return to the university town to be with their friends. Many people don't have homes or can't stay at home, and so on. So we need a model which gives that choice and which keeps people safe. And as I say, it all hinges on this issue of the pivot to the default being online teaching. So I would say that's the number one thing. Number two, universities have got to be flexible in allowing people to work from home, or indeed to defer if they want to defer. And number three, we need to be far more systematic in the support and the wraparound support, not just token support, wraparound support we need to give to all students, especially those who are isolated.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Anyone else want to come in on that? Mary, Matt, Anne? And where we go for semester 2 and what the expectations are?
Just to say, I agree absolutely with what Steve has been saying. My one concern is we need to do this all incredibly quickly. People need to know now what's going to be the situation in January, because some people will be leaving or moving right now, and they need to know, are they booking a return ticket, or can they leave their stuff, or are they going to be able to work from home? And I think the other bit around the timing is around the testing. I mean, I think everyone said that, NUS, UCU, employers, we all called for testing in August. It's going to be rolled out. And Anne or yourself might want to say something about Dundee, because it's really unclear who is administering and providing that testing regime. And if it's staff and students, that they need to be kept safe. So it just feels it's rushed, and there's not enough thought and consideration behind these really important issues.
Anne, would you like to come in on that?
Dundee, for example, is currently planning its student testing, and yesterday I saw on the staff the website advertisements for a huge number of members of staff to staff the provision. And so quite clearly, universities, well, my reading of it is they are struggling with resourcing what they have said they will do. And those test sites are due to open very soon. And yet it would seem to me at the moment there's neither staff in place, and from the advertisements that are there, staff still also have to be trained. I noticed also another aspect of that site was that it suggested there that staff could be seconded. So existing university staff can be seconded to work in the testing site, which raises another question in my mind is, what about the work, all the work that's currently being done in their existing roles? There's an assumption that that can be put to one side in order to address testing. So, yeah, I don't have an answer, but I'll just see a huge problem in front of us there in terms of delivering this whole testing process.
Okay, thanks, Anne. It's nearly 15:15, so I was going to ask everyone if they want to make some final comments. We had two other questions which came in, which you may want to refer to, and again, they're quite similar in terms of what do we do now? How do we deal with the problems we're facing? So one of the questions is about why is mask wearing, why isn't it compulsory in all environments in the university? And the second one was, what do we do about the universities not publishing data on COVID infections? What can branches do? So those are two questions. So if you want to sum up and maybe reference to those two questions as well, would anyone like to go first? In fact, I'll come to you last, Mary. You can have the last word as UCU Scotland president. Matt, do you want to go first? We'll go in the order we started with, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know so much about some of those questions that have came in. I'm not a public health expert on masks and things, but I think the key thing for me to finish on, I think, is actually picking up on what Steve said. I think right now we need to move to a position where students can have a choice about what they want to do. It's worth saying that the vast majority of students in Scotland don't live in halls, but it's become the kind of central of our attention because of the way it's constructed. But I do think students do need a choice. They need to be able to decide right now, if you're looking in the next couple of weeks, am I going to get a test? I want to go back to say my family home. In order to make an informed decision on that, you need to know what your learning and teaching is going to look like in January. If universities continue to promise, you need to make yourself available for in-person teaching, that will hinder students' ability to decide just now as to whether they want to move home permanently. And if they'll be able to access their learning from perhaps our family home. And again, I'd pick up on what Steve said as well. There's going to be students that stay in the halls, care experience students, estranged students, international students throughout the winter time, and we really need to make sure that they're supported. You sometimes hear chat in the media and the press about should we close student halls. Student halls were never closed. There was people living in the student halls across, the entire summer. The issue is obviously the kind of encouraging all students back, and I do think the central thing is giving students that choice just now to try and keep us all safe. And yeah, there's going to be challenges, but in terms of how we keep universities safe, again, I come back to it where I started. I think we need to listen to the students and the staff, because I think we called it right over the summer, and I think it would have been an easier, again, still difficult, but we would have had an easier time of it throughout this semester if the views of NUS and UCU were reflected stronger in the government guidance.
Thanks, Matt. That's really helpful. Anne, do you want to go next? And then I'll get Steve to come.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I support absolutely what Matt's saying there. In terms of mask wearing directly, well, not an expert like Matt, but I following what Steve says, periods of exposure put you more at risk. As far as I'm concerned, any barrier that you can put in place that reduces that risk, then I'll be supportive of, and so therefore supporting mask wearing. In terms of from a staff and a student point of view, again, I'll go back to what I said earlier, is that from a staff perspective, think about the resources that are available to support you in terms of protecting you in your workplace. That's really important. And a key thing in all of this, working with students and working with your colleagues, is about solidarity. And that's what we are offering as a union, is solidarity in terms of working together collectively in the best interest of student and staff. So we support you to work with your union and work with your students.
Thanks, Anne. Steve, do you want to sum up? Okay,
so one of the things I've been arguing throughout the pandemic in general terms is we need to get away from a narrative of blame to a narrative of support in relationship to the general public. And I think that's true of universities as well. First of all, we've got to pivot away from the blame against students, which has been quite widespread in many places. And we've got to support students and give them the choices that we've talked about where to study and how to be study and how to be safe. And equally, I don't think it's particularly helpful for us to blame university administrations and university vice chancellors. I think, again, we need to call for the support that they need in order to allow those choices to students. They need that funding in order to be able to make it possible to empty their halls to some extent, for them to be able to say to students, if you make the choice to suspend, you can do it. But I just want to finish by raising one point we haven't talked about yet, and in many ways for me is possibly the most important point of all, which is the issue of admissions next year, because we know of the massive inequalities there are in education. We know the way poorer kids have lost up to 4 months education, whereas richer kids from independent schools have lost nothing at all. And I think there needs to be, supported by the Scottish Government, a real pivot in terms of admissions policies to make sure that students from deprived backgrounds who get minimum standards are guaranteed places, because otherwise we will be complicit in the greatest increase of inequality in our society for many a long year. So I hope that that issue will become a priority for UCU, for NUS, and for the Scottish Government.
Thanks, Steve. That is a huge issue, and I think a really important one that actually is going to raise its head very, very quickly. And the exam factory system is just simply not fit for purpose in this pandemic. Thanks for that. That's a really important point to take home with. Mary, do you want to finish off? And then I'll get the last word in, I suppose, as chair.
Yeah, no, you will, Carlo. Yeah, just reflecting on the points that Steve and you've also made there, Carlo. You know, it's barely a year since Jeremy Corbyn proposed free broadband across the UK, and you know, when that was proposed in November 2019, people were laughing. They thought it was frivolous. They thought it was, you know, a crazy policy. It was really mocked. But I do think this year has shown the digital divide and has shown, you know, the internet is our window to the world, and without a good broadband connection, without the devices that we have, and without the skills, it's been really incredibly difficult to engage at school, in the workplace, in the lecture theatre. So, you know, it is a really important point. And, you know, Steve, you asked for UCU to campaign on that, and we certainly will, and particularly around, you know, the whole widening access agenda. It's really close to our trade union's heart. I'd better also answer, well, or refer to the face coverings question too, because face coverings are required in most places on campus, in all physical indoor spaces where the physical distancing isn't allowed. So I think I would need to check. So I think you're right that you may not be required to wear one when sitting in a tutorial. However, I know that most people are, and so many institutions have, together with trade unions and student associations, they have agreed policies around face coverings, and I'm sure you've seen some of the badged visors that some people have been using too. So because we agree absolutely, and also on ventilation. I mean, UCU made representations on both those points, on mandatory face coverings for everyone that can use them, and on ventilation. And you know, I mean, in a Scottish winter, it's not really realistic to have the windows open, but that's exactly what our health and safety reps are advising. I think 2 points I want to make, though, for my conclusions. The first of all, again, taking care of ourselves and mental health and well-being, both of staff and students. I think for us as a trade union, that has to be a priority, because, you know, this pandemic has affected people in terrible ways. So, you know, I think we need to have that high up our agenda. This also shows, I think, how the market has failed. A marketised approach to education doesn't work. And again, for UCU, that's another key priority that we were pursuing anyway. But just this pandemic underlines the fact that, you know, if you value education, you need to pay for it through the public purse. So thanks, Carlo.
Thanks, Mary. Okay, thanks everybody. So thanks Matt, Anne, Steve and Mary for speaking. Thank you to Seamus and Pri for doing the translations for us. I just want to finish up on one quick point. Trade unions mean that we have a voice. We aren't simply passive recipients of what's happening to us here. And I think the more members are involved in their local branches, raising the kind of questions that were discussed in the chat here and have been raised today, I think the more powerful we've got of that voice. We need to show solidarity to the students who are protesting, particularly those in Manchester at the moment. We've also got a trade union branch in Brighton UCU, which is due to take strike action in the coming weeks over job cuts, and a number of other branches are currently balloting over similar types of cuts. So we have to stand together, and we can actually influence these events, and I think we're already seeing that. So although we're in the midst of a pandemic, although we're all disparate in terms of where we're working and how we're working, that doesn't diminish our power at all. If anything, actually our voices are even greater, paradoxically, in this environment. So I'd encourage people to be involved in their union. Go to the online branch meetings that your branches are organised, and get involved in your trade union if you're not a member already. Okay, so thanks everybody. I should thank Mike rather, behind the scenes, who's been doing the tech stuff. No one's seen who he is, but he's there. And thanks to all the audience who've listened into this conversation and discussion. So thanks everyone. Okay, take care and stay safe. Okay, bye.
Bye.